Have you ever noticed how the first few months of learning a new language can feel incredibly rewarding and motivating? You're constantly picking up new words, you're understanding more from the context you get, and maybe even starting to speak. And then something changes. Progress seems to slow down. Welcome to the Intermediate Plateau. It's that awkward place where you're not a beginner anymore, but you definitely wouldn't call yourself fluent either. Or maybe you're somewhat like me, A2 when sober, C1 when drunk. In this video, we'll look at why this plateau even happens, why it's completely natural and even dictated by Zipf's law, and what strategies you can apply to break through it. Because you absolutely can. Let's start by understanding what this plateau really is and why it happens. The intermediate plateau is not just about having good and bad days, though those definitely exist. It's about reaching that point where the same methods that got you to an intermediate level simply stop working as effectively. Or at least that's what you think. When you start learning a language, you're constantly encountering the most common words. Just 100 words make up about 50%, that is half of written English, which is completely crazy, honestly. To get to 80%, however, you need about 2,000 or even 3,000 words. Maybe we can spot a trend here already. Naturally, your early progress feels fast because you're picking up the most frequently used vocabulary. And you see or hear these words absolutely everywhere. That's why they become very easily rememberable. There is an interesting concept called Zipf's law that tells us what is happening here. It states that word frequency drops off exponentially. The most common word appears about twice as often as the second most common word, 3 times as often as the third, and so on. This means that as you progress, you encounter new words less and less frequently. And since you encounter these words less frequently, they also become harder to remember. Because if the word is not used as much, it ultimately means that you maybe take too much time until you see it again, so that you struggle with remembering it. You maybe already forgot it. It's like diminishing returns applied to language learning. Let's look at a simple example. Going from not knowing the word big, for example, to knowing it unlocks a lot of conversational options. You can describe size, importance, and significance. It's in fact so useful that you will encounter it or use it multiple times every day. But going from big to enormous to colossal to gargantuan, each of these words appears less frequently than the last, which means it takes longer to learn them through natural exposure. And this is exactly why so many people feel stuck at this, let's say, B1 level. You've mastered the basics and you can handle everyday situations, but going beyond that becomes more and more challenging. And not because you're doing anything wrong, it's just that's literally how language works. So a lack of vocabulary might be your biggest weakness, limited passive vocabulary in listening and reading, and even more limited active one for writing and speaking. Additionally, your grammar is probably not rock solid. Talking about the present is comfortable, but about the past and maybe the future, not so much, depending on your language. Especially if there are like 10 tenses to choose from. This stage can feel very different for different people and also different languages. Some of you may find the early stages of new languages daunting, but then really get going with immersion after mastering the basics. Others feel excitement for the early challenge, but then get frustrated when progress slows down at the intermediate level. And the comfort zone can become an issue here. After all, you are already communicating. It's a bit of a paradox, because on one side, you think you are good enough, but then at the same time, you feel frustrated that you're not progressing fast enough. I want to be clear with one thing here. If you are happy with your current intermediate level and want to dedicate your time to another language or something else entirely, that's completely valid. But if you want to push further, keep watching. First things first, let's talk about mindset, which may just be the most important factor after all. Yes, there are strategies you can apply that I would specifically suggest for this stage, but as long as you are exposing yourself to the language and consistently look positive towards this process, you will improve no matter what, even if you don't feel like it. I believe that the intermediate plateau has nothing to do with your talent. And like I said, it's natural and even necessary. What's a little tricky about this phase or stage is that progress becomes less and less measurable. In the beginning, every new word is a clear win. Now, the improvements are more subtle, but you can still see them by doing the following. Look back at content you found challenging a few months ago, maybe a YouTube video or an article. Chances are it feels much easier now. This is why keeping some kind of record can be incredibly valuable. You could be writing in your target language in your diary or in some kind of other daily journaling. When you flip back these pages after a while, these snapshots will help you see how far you've actually come. It also helps you to focus on effort instead of results. While results are less measurable at this stage, your effort is not. You can very easily track how many minutes you spend listening, watching and reading in your target language, or how many flashcards you're reviewing if that's your thing. By the way, both of these tips are core features I built into Lengia. That's kind of the cool thing when you can program and just build your own ideal language learning app. Lengia tracks your time and activity through actual word exposure and shows you familiarity levels as well as how many new and reinforcing words you've been exposed to. Because at this stage, it's more about consistency and habits rather than immediate results. I also just released a new feature that I'm particularly excited about. It came to me in a dream, actually. It's a daily writing system that gives you topics or questions to write about, but with a twist. You can just write freely using whatever vocabulary you know, and when you get stuck, just throw in words from your native language. The AI will then give you immediate feedback on how to express those parts better in your target language. And if you want to, you can immediately create flashcards from these suggestions super easily. This approach has several benefits. First, it makes starting to write much more approachable, because you can just go with the flow and don't need to constantly look up words. Second, it teaches you new vocabulary and even grammar through context, your own context even, because after all, these are your thoughts. Third, it helps you to turn your passive vocabulary into active vocabulary by producing output. And finally, like I mentioned before, you can look back at what you wrote weeks or months ago and actually see your improvement. So pretty neat, I think. But whether you use Lengia or not, the key is that you just keep going. So pick whatever lets you enjoy the process. Let's talk about some more practical strategies to get you over this plateau. Changing the kind of input you receive can help a lot. You need to start pushing yourself into somewhat unknown territory. I'll give you a few examples. For a month or so, I went through an obsessive Stardew Valley phase. Not only did I play it in Spanish, but I also watched this Argentinian Let's Player who was definitely above my level at the time. But because I was so interested in the content, I just stuck with it. And eventually I started understanding more and more of her slang and got used to her pronunciation and tempo rather quickly. So you gotta just embrace this ambiguity. You don't have to understand everything at first. It works even better if you are interested in a variety of fields and formats to get exposure to more niche vocabulary. Maybe it's sports commentary, tech reviews, or cooking shows. Whatever gets you excited enough to push through that initial difficulty. I also picked up new vocabulary like rebote and tiro libre from watching NBA broadcasts in Spanish. Heck, you can even try listening to content at higher speeds. Put it on 1.5 and challenge yourself. You'll get exposed to more words in the same time and also get used to the Chilean speech rates.
Suerte, cariño, saludo a mi hija, a mi familia y para toda la gente chilena y para usted, para su país. Suerte, cariño.
Gracias, amigo.
Once again, I want to highlight a small feature of Lengia here. Yes, I know I advertise my shit here more than usually, but I just think it's a great tool for intermediates specifically and not so much for beginners yet. So look at this. When generating stories for your interests, you can set a focus point of what you want to learn. This could be heavy usage of a certain time, or just letting it know with a prompt like this that you specifically want more unusual vocabulary to get the best bang for your buck or time when reading or listening to the content. Extensive reading is also a great way to improve further. It kind of goes without saying that if you simply read more, you will encounter more words, even those more uncommon ones. Written texts usually have a wider vocabulary than normal conversations. So in case your language input has mostly come from podcasts, maybe it's time to pick up a book. This will also help your grammar quite a bit as you constantly get exposed to correct grammatical structures that your brain magically stores somehow. I made a full video on how to do extensive reading optimally that you can check out here. If speaking is your biggest hurdle, then maybe practice speaking more. Great insight, I know. Speaking is the highest anxiety activity for most language learners, including me. So unless you're like my friend who visited me in Peru with not even A1, literally A0 level Spanish skills, but trying to explain Germany's energy markets and solar technology in Spanish anyway, it's better to find low pressure environments. Writing can be a good transition strategy from passive to active, and I would urge you to try out the ChatGPT Advanced Voice Mode that I covered in a previous video. The key to all these techniques is that you push yourself just enough to make progress, but not too much so that you get frustrated and quit. Remember that this plateau is just a stage. You might be there for a long time, or like I said in the intro, at least feel like you're not progressing, even though you do. But it's not permanent unless you let it be. And if you're wondering why some things just feel different or harder to express in your target language, check out my video about linguistic relativity next. We check how different languages might influence the way we express ourselves and maybe even our thoughts, which becomes especially interesting once you reach this intermediate level, where you start noticing these subtle differences. Thank you for watching, and I see you next time.